All right, welcome back. I want to highlight some elements of human geography and especially economic geography of North America. Economic geography, as you might guess, is about the distribution of an organization of economic activity. And so let's talk a little bit about the economics of North America. Now, mostly we're going to focus on the United States, but to a lesser extent, this also applies to Canada, because Canada, like the United States, is a highly industrialized country. First thing I want to look at is economic sectors of the economy. That economists often divide how people make a living into three different groups. People who work in the primary sector, or harvesting or using commodities from nature, people who work in the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, and people who work in the tertiary sector, providing services. When you do your reading for this chapter, they'll talk about some higher level sectors like the quaternary sector, but those are really also part of the tertiary sector. Usually this is a figure that kind of shows the structure of it. The idea is that you have the primary sector, which is collecting goods from nature, the secondary sector, which is sort of a next level of production, and then finally you have what's called the service sector, or providing some type of service rather than goods. Just some examples. These are some of the primary industries. Again, about using or harvesting commodities from nature, like agriculture, mining, and fishing. And one thing that we'll see is that in other parts of the world, a greater percentage of people work in primary industries than they do in North America. Secondary industries are often what we call blue-collar jobs. These include factory jobs, food processing, refining oil, and construction. And lastly, the tertiary sector is what we often call the service sector of the economy, that instead of producing goods, you're providing some type of service like government, hospitality, restaurants, education, healthcare, and so on. In my face-to-face class, one thing I do at this point oftentimes is have people raise their hand if they work in the primary sector, such as a farmer, or secondary sector, such as in construction, or whether they work in some type of services. And usually what we find is that most of the class works in this tertiary sector. That's also true in North America overall, that if you look at the growth of jobs and how jobs have changed over time, that most people in North America work in that tertiary sector, either in public services or consumer services and so on. And lesser amount of people work in secondary industries like manufacturing and construction, and very, very few people work in agriculture or other primary industries. Now that's changed over time. If we kind of go back to the 1800s, what these stand for, MDCs are industrialized countries like the United States, and LDCs are less industrialized countries, like what we often call the third world countries in Asia, Africa, and other places. And originally, back in the 1800s, we all, like 3/4 of us, worked in primary industries, meaning about 3/4 of people were farmers. And maybe less than 1/4 of people worked in either tertiary or secondary industries. And if we look at the less developed countries, that continues on for quite a bit. But with the Industrial Revolution, what happens in industrialized countries is the people working in the primary sectors goes down, while the people who work in the secondary and tertiary sector continues to rise. I'm going to move myself up here. Now, one thing I want to point out is there is a change that we'll discuss in a moment around 1970. And around 1970, one thing that happens in the more industrialized countries is that people who work in manufacturing starts to decline. At the same time, in the less industrialized countries, they begin to become more industrialized in the 1970s, and their jobs go up. If you've ever heard of people, jobs being sent overseas or outsourced, this is kind of, this part of the graph is showing some of that. So let's take a look back historically. And one thing I want to mention again is the Industrial Revolution, which is a real important change in how we began to organize economically. And by the late 1800s, the United States, or after the Civil War primarily, the United States became a highly industrialized country, one of the leading economic powers of the world. And part of that was the development of what was called the urban system, the interconnected industrial cities of the United States, initially connected by train, later connected by freeways. And where you saw this most intently is in this part of the Northeast, what's called the manufacturing belt. Oftentimes now it's called the Rust Belt because of all the aging factories, but this was a really intensely developed part of the United States. And during the Industrial Revolution, it's really in these urban areas that you had the change from primary to secondary and tertiary employment. Here's the manufacturing belt from the East Coast into the interior of the United States. Two other trends that we've seen more strict out to outer regions of the city or the suburbs. And this happens primarily after World War II, that during World War II, many factories were producing high number of goods for the war. And after the war, a lot of those factories were producing things like automobiles. So it's really with the automobile after World War II that you had a move of people migrating from the central business district or downtowns out into these outer suburbs. And what we see now is many of these suburbs, like Clovis and North Fresno, they function almost as their own cities. That, you know, you think about how often you have to go downtown for something. It's probably not that often, or downtown Fresno anyway. The other trend that we've seen since the 1970s is that thing we highlighted on the graph, industrialization. This is about the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States. So two things I'll highlight is that suburbanization happens after World War II, and deindustrialization is really something that happens later around the 1970s. Showing, these are some figures, they're from a different type, but showing the density of people in different parts of Cleveland, Ohio. In 1900, people work and they had to live close by. And with the advent of streetcars and some early public transportation, people started to move a little bit further out into the city. But after World War II, by 1960s, to these suburban areas of Cleveland, and less people actually lived downtown. Now, between 1960s on, we have industrialization. So that by the 90s back and forth here, one thing you see is some emptying out of cities. One other part of the economy is what we call agribusiness, and this is something locally because this is an element of commercial agriculture. While this is considered the primary sector, it is very industrialized in North America. And what so North America is a major producer of food in the world, especially here in the Central Valley. However, not a whole lot of people work in agriculture. Maybe 5% of people work in agriculture. But if we have so few people in North America, why is it that we're so that is a point of discussion, and you can probably, there's a big hint in the background that we use a lot of technology. Next, I want to post a YouTube video that highlights some of the technology. So, and we will catch up more later.